President-elect Bola Tinubu says the administration will put incentives and policies in place to make corruption unattractive for judges and other Nigerian workers. He said the temptation for corruption will reduce if the right incentives that guarantee a conducive working atmosphere are implemented. Tinubu said this during the inauguration of Justice Ndu Magistrate Court Complex in Port Harcourt, Rivers State. The event is part of the two days visit to the state to inaugurate projects executed by Nyesom Wike.
This is the way to fight corruption. You don't expect your judges. I have been contributing very well to this. You don't expect your judges to live in squalor, to dispense justice in squalor. This is part of the changes that is necessary in our policy think tank. We must fight corruption, and we definitely must look at the other side of the coin. If you don't want your judges to be corrupt, you got to pay attention to their welfare. We don't want our judges to play foul, to compromise justice. Not just the books, but do something. And I promise you, we are going to review all of these in a policy think tank.
My problem is not this editing, my problem is the maintenance. Because I feel so bad that you do a structure like this, and those who are responsible for it, you come back here in the next 6 months, you ask yourself, why did I even embark upon this? Beautiful as it is, I hope in the next 6 months, it will still be like this. Most people complain, no money, no money, nobody. Even the little you are giving, you don't want to use it and do the right thing. Just like when we handed over the law school to the Council of Legal Education, the state government gave out 400 million naira. Look, put it in our account for the maintenance of the structure. We give them properties where they can use to make money to keep the school. We don't want a situation where they will say, oh, the federal government have not released money. The money they release is too small. Okay, let the federal government be paying your salary. Take this to maintain the school. I was told the other day that there was no light. There was no water. I can't understand our system.
Let's talk about Ayo.
Yes, day 2 of President-elect Asiwaju Bola Ahmed Tinubu's visit to Rivers State on the invitation of Governor Nyesom Wike. He had a number of things to say, and I believe that as we're just talking about it now, that there are a few things that we had addressed yesterday, and it gave him an opportunity to perhaps speak to those things. But the focus this morning, of course, I'd like to talk about is with regards to he saying that he would make corruption unattractive, and this he would do by providing incentives and creating policies through a think tank that he would set up as president, or once he becomes president. This is Asiwaju Bola Ahmed Tinubu speaking. And, you know, on hearing that, that is absolutely appropriate. So I'll ask in terms of how do we tackle this big issue of corruption? And he was speaking to that because he said that the magistrate's quarter he was commissioning in Rivers State was one of the tools to fighting corruption. Because when you provide a conducive environment for judges now, you know, addressing the judges now, or the judiciary, when you provide a conducive environment for judges to work, it makes it less attractive, perhaps, to bend to receiving, you know, going through the back door to receiving bribes or being induced, let me use that word, to rule a case in one's favor. But beyond that, I read an article by Justice Ayo Salami where he was talking about a focus on eradicating corruption in the judiciary. And I quite like his take on some recommendations that perhaps the president-elect could look into with regards to fostering or pushing his commitment to fighting corruption. mind you, I'm hopeful, as with other Nigerians, I would imagine, that we wouldn't have a promise that was made, like the promise that was made when President Muhammadu Buhari was running for election himself, or before he became president, on the platform of fighting corruption, ending corruption, and people really bought into that. But unfortunately, a few incidents that happened during his tenure didn't quite align with this fight for corruption. But that is his tenure. Let's face the future. So the first thing that Justice Salami had noted was that when it comes to corruption, especially when we're looking at the judiciary, it is not just one particular area. We have a culture of corruption, unfortunately, in this nation, Nigeria. It cuts across. You can look at the different sectors, you can look at the different areas and different personalities. In fact, when we go abroad, unfortunately and sadly, some of the things that they say or talk about is that, oh, someone has described Nigeria or Nigerians as being fantastically corrupt. And of course, when we look at the judiciary in this case, there have been some issues around just how fair or transparent judges are in Nigeria. So one of the things we must do, according to his recommendation, is number one, we must make less appealing this culture of corruption or celebrating things that we ought not to celebrate. For instance, we don't disparage instances where we see someone who is spending money lavishly, young or old, without a source of income that is commensurate to how they are spending. This is a country that rewards people. As long as you have money, that's all it takes. So we look at politicians who obtain their wealth improperly, and yet we look at those who are working hard to earn their money as being slow or not being smart or sharp enough. This culture of encouraging or just supporting corruption or celebrating corruption must end. We must cut it at its roots. It's not just by incentives alone, but may this think tank begin to think of how to make it less attractive to be corrupt. And perhaps it could start by the politicians themselves, by ensuring that there's transparency, there's openness, they are able to demonstrate as leaders the sources of their income. We also must restore the dignity of labor. We must ensure that, in terms of rewarding hard work, rewarding honesty, rewarding people who are upright and making it more attractive. If we don't do this and we have a culture of corruption in this nation, no matter how many magistrates courts you build, no matter how many things you do, you will still continue to fight it. We must strengthen our institution. The FCC, for instance, was set up to tackle this. But what has been seen in time and time again, unfortunately, is that sometimes it's used as a tool of vendetta, whereby the people who ought to be in EFCC net or being investigated are not. So perhaps strengthen institutions and make them independent. And finally, to the judiciary, a lot of attention has been put on the National Judiciary Council, making it more independent and less, influence from the executive in terms of Nigeria. And of course, the appointment of judges themselves. Later on, I believe we're going to talk about the issue of the judges in Nasarawa, who they say do not even have the qualifications to be lawyers, and yet they are in court judging. What are the processes to appointing judges in Nigeria? These are some of the things I hope that they will look into.
Okay. There is a general consensus, both locally and internationally, that corruption poses a threat to sustainable development. And here in Nigeria, those who analyze this subject, Transparency International and other bodies, have told us that, look, Nigeria has lost trillions of money since independence. So anybody saying we'll fight corruption is not saying anything new. Absolutely nothing new. It's a no-brainer. That, look, part of the challenge in this environment is the corrosive impact of corruption over the decades. Now, with regard to Asiwaju Bola Ahmed Tinubu, I know, there have been some cynical comments. And I recall in that regard an article written by my former colleague, Etum, when he was assessing the Tinubu manifesto. And he devoted about 2-3 paragraphs in that piece to the fact that, look, he had taken a look at that 88-page Renewed Hope manifesto, that he thought that there was very scant attention paid to, what the president-elect or presidential candidate of the APC, as he then was going to do about corruption. And he thought that that was a very serious oversight in that manifesto. So I hope people like Etim will now be satisfied that Asiwaju Bola Ahmed Tinubu is talking about fighting corruption, and that he will put policies and measures in place to check corruption. However, part of the challenge we have had in Nigeria is that, or elsewhere, is that there's something that is called grand corruption. There's also something called petty corruption. That's how Transparency International classifies it. Now, the part of the challenge with fighting corruption is that more attention tends to be paid to petty corruption rather than grand corruption. And when you are talking about grand corruption, you are talking about institutional corruption. You are talking about the lack of political will to do the right things. So, I know that Asiwaju Bola Ahmed Tinubu has no shortage of experts who can help construct a view in this regard. But I'll come back to that later. But he was speaking in the context of setting up, of commissioning a magistrate's court complex in Port Harcourt. And he was talking in relation to the judiciary. Yes, the welfare of judges is very important. And I think he's eminently qualified to talk about that. He, as governor of Lagos State, having paid very serious attention to the reform of the judicial sector and facilitating the administration of justice. So when he talks about addressing the welfare of judges, he has been there, he has the experience. And indeed, it is important that our judges are given an enabling environment, not just in terms of structures, but also in terms of the environment that will facilitate their work and make it easier for them, to deliver justice on a sustainable, consistent basis. Then he said, as regards the ordinary worker, that there will be policies in place that will empower the average worker to be able to own property. And his assumption is that people have property, they will not be tempted to steal. Well, some people are greedy. Part of the conundrum of corruption also has to do with corruption. Sometimes you ask yourself, when is it enough? You will see some people who have been ministers in this outgoing administration, who have been chairmen of boards, and some of them, if they appoint them as messengers in the Tinubu administration, they will say, yes, I'm serving my country. So Nigerians are very shameless. All they are looking for is just access to the corridors of power, to have access to state resources, which is why the battle has to be fought at the institutional level. Why is it that you can't enter Nigeria at the airport without people looking at you like they want to collect money from you? Corruption in the civil service. Why is it that your file cannot move in the ministries except, you pay money to move the file, to get the file moving? Why is it that a man will be, in a public position, he will recruit for himself about 100 special assistants? All these special assistants, either from their church or from their mosque or from their village. These are dimensions of corruption that we talk about. But the thing is to make the governance space a space for transparency, for accountability. Those are the larger principles rather than, the episodic, dramatic cases that we see out there. However, Bola Ahmed Tinubu as president of Nigeria, you can assume that, he's coming to power on a historical note. And he knows that he has a responsibility to make an impact at his level, at his age, with what he has been through. Well, he has a responsibility to make a difference for many reasons, both cultural, political, and also at the level of self-actualization. And those who are cynical that, you shouldn't talk about corruption, well, he may well disappoint them, because if he's confronted with a case and there is compelling evidence, he, as president of Nigeria, is not going to ridicule himself by saying, he will look the other way. Because when you are president of Nigeria, well, you are there to make history, because it's not every day that, people have the opportunity to lead a country as big as this, a country as rich as this. What remains is for our leaders to show the example. When leaders show good example, the people who follow suit. What is that newspaper again? The West African Pilot, Rufai. Show the light.
Show the light.
Right?
Yeah.
And the people, will know the way. So leadership by example should be the guiding principle.
Truth has to be said. He said all the right things yesterday, second day of the 2-day visit in Rivers State. But I'd like to tell you how corruption affects judiciary. It is very organized. The greatest way to stop corruption in judiciary is to make politics unattractive with money. because one of the greatest perpetrators of corruption in judiciary are the politicians themselves. So when they get into politics because they're attractive, the politicians institute a series of action that leads to state capture, where they capture wealth, capture opportunities, capture prospects. They become very rich. And with that also, they capture the functions of the different tiers of government. So they have loyalty and alliances in judiciary. They have loyalty and alliances in the legislative arm of government, and institutes and parastatals of government. They have loyalties and alliances there. And all of it works together in a symbiotic way to oil their wheel of corruption to do their bidding. Most of the money passed on in these corrupt activities, predominantly most of them come from corrupt politicians that help them, in turn, get judgments to favor them. And that's why you see, once you go up the power ladder in Nigeria as a politician, that pretty much start for amassing wealth through state capture, making organs of government function in your place, then build influence capital. When you are able to do those three things, you have a retinue of people that are tied to you that will be able to aid and abate your corruption. So the very first way to break that cycle is to make government unattractive, constantly whittle down the political power of politicians, and subject them to a great deal of accountability, break the mold of any form of state capture, because corruption only thrives where there's an abundance of cash. Then after doing that, then you can now talk about the welfare. So when you talk about the welfare means setting up an ecosystem of sustainability after, post-retirement for the judges. And that's where things like house scheme and the likes come in, pension, and also giving them appreciable pay and investing in the judiciary. The funny irony is the fact that the judiciary are supposed to be able to build their own courts. The idea that politicians and governors are even building courts and giving judiciary officials cars doesn't even make it right in the first place. And those are the things that even open up the judiciary to corruption. How ironic that we're talking about corruption in judiciary, but we are also there to launch a project where a governor is giving largesse building for the judiciary, where the judiciary is supposed to have its own purse that comes from the federal government. So you can see the irony of our country. So I think once you can do those two things, then you can be able to break the barrier of this corruption. So build about an ecosystem of a social structure that people are remunerated properly, but most importantly, whittle down the power of political influence, state capture, and power influence among the political class. But I tell you that it is doing the whittling down of power among the political class that will give the biggest desired results. Because if government is not attractive, there's a lot of accountability. You hardly cannot steal when you are in government. You will not have the paraphernalia to bribe people to build state capture, start bribing the judiciary and doing things in your favor. Then if we do that, then we can plow the money that is normally frittered away in state capture into building a societal ecosystem of social stability and social aid and welfare. And then we can in turn focus the attention of wealth to building industries and enterprise that can employ people and reduce unemployment. I submit there.